Hi, friends. Welcome back to Read. I'm Miss Kinsler. I will be reading today, and I am continuing in Mary Poppins. All right, let's get started. When their mother had gone, Jane and Michael edged toward Mary Poppins, who stood, still as a post, with her hands folded in front of her. "How did you come?" Jane asked. "It looked just as if the wind blew you here." "It did," said Mary Poppins briefly, and she proceeded to unwind her muffler from her neck and to take off her hat, which she hung on one of the bedposts. As it did not seem as though Mary Poppins were going to say any more, though she sniffed a great deal, Jane, too, remained silent. But when she bent down to undo her bag, Michael could not restrain himself. "What a funny bag," he said, pinching it with his fingers. "Carpet," said Mary Poppins, putting her key in the lock. "To carry carpets in, you mean?" "No, made of." "Oh," said Michael, "I see." But he didn't quite. By this time the bag was open, and Jane and Michael were more than surprised to find it was completely empty. "Why," said Jane, "there's nothing in it." "What do you mean, nothing?" demanded Mary Poppins, drawing herself up and looking as though she had been insulted. "Nothing in it, did you say?" And with that, she took out from the empty bag a starched white apron and tied it round her waist. Next, she unpacked a large cake of Sunlight soap, a toothbrush, a packet of hairpins, a bottle of perfume, a small folding armchair, and a box of throat lozenges. Jane and Michael stared. "But I saw," whispered Michael. "It was empty." "Hush," said Jane, as Mary Poppins took out a large bottle labeled 1 teaspoon to be taken at bedtime. A spoon was attached to the neck of the bottle, and into this Mary Poppins poured a dark crimson fluid. "Is that your medicine?" enquired Michael, looking very interested. "No, yours," said Mary Poppins, holding out the spoon to him. Michael stared. He wrinkled up his nose. He began to protest. "I don't want it. I don't need it. I won't." But Mary Poppins' eyes were fixed upon him, and Michael suddenly discovered that you could not look at Mary Poppins and disobey her. There was something strange and extraordinary about her, something that was frightening, and at the same time most exciting. The spoon came nearer. He held his breath, shut his eyes, and gulped. A delicious taste ran round his mouth. He turned his tongue in it. He swallowed, and a happy smile ran round his face. "Strawberry ice cream," he said ecstatically. "More, more, more!" But Mary Poppins, her face as stern as before, was pouring out a dose for Jane. It ran into the spoon, silvery, greeny, yellowy. Jane tasted it. "Lime juice cordial," she said, sliding her tongue deliciously over her lips. But when she saw Mary Poppins moving towards the twins with the bottle, Jane rushed at her. "Oh, no, please. They're too young. It wouldn't be good for them. Please." Mary Poppins, however, took no notice, but with a warning, terrible glance at Jane, tipped the spoon toward John's mouth. He lapped at it eagerly, and by the few drops that were spilt on his bib, Jane and Michael could tell that the substance in the spoon this time was milk. Then Barbara had her share, and she gurgled and licked the spoon twice. Mary Poppins then poured out another dose and solemnly took it herself. Rum punch, she said, smacking her lips and corking the bottle. Jane's eyes and Michael's popped with astonishment, but they were not given much time to wonder, for Mary Poppins, having put the miraculous bottle on the mantelpiece, turned to them. Now, she said, spit Spot into bed, and she began to undress them. They noticed that whereas buttons and hooks had needed all sorts of coaxing from Katie Nana, for Mary Poppins they flew apart almost at a look. In less than a minute they found themselves in bed and watching, by the dim light from the night light, the rest of Mary Poppins' unpacking being performed. From the carpet bag she took out 7 flannel nightgowns, 4 cotton ones, a pair of boots, a set of dominoes, 2 bathing caps, and a postcard album. Last of all came a folding camp bedstead with blankets and eiderdown complete, and this she set between John's cot and Barbara's. Jane and Michael sat hugging themselves and watching. It was all so surprising that they couldn't find nothing to say, but they knew, both of them, that something strange and wonderful had happened at number 17 Cherry Tree Lake. Mary Poppins, slipping one of the flannel nightgowns over her head, began to undress underneath it as though it were a tent. Michael, charmed by the strange new arrival, unable to keep silent any longer, called to her. "Mary Poppins," he cried, "you'll never leave us, will you?" There was no reply from under the nightgown. Michael could not bear it. "You won't leave us, will you?" he called anxiously. Mary Poppins' head came out of the top of the nightgown. She looked very fierce. "One more word from that direction," she said threateningly, "and I'll call the policeman." "I was only saying," began Michael meekly, "that we hoped you wouldn't be going away soon." He stopped, feeling very red and confused. Mary Poppins stared from him to Jane in silence. Then she sniffed. "I'll stay till the wind changes," she said shortly, and she blew out her candle and got into bed. "That's all right," said Michael, half to himself and half to Jane. But Jane wasn't listening. She was thinking about all that had happened and wondering. And that is how Mary Poppins came to live at number 17 Cherry Tree Lane. And although they sometimes found themselves wishing for the quieter, more ordinary days when Katie Nana ruled the household, everybody, on the whole, was glad of Mary Poppins' arrival. Mr. Banks was glad because as she arrived by herself and did not hold up the traffic, he had not had to tip the policeman. Mrs. Banks was glad because she was able to tell everybody that her children's nurse was so fashionable that she didn't believe in giving references. Mrs. Brill and Ellen were glad because they could drink strong cups of tea all day in the kitchen and no longer needed to preside at nursery suppers. Robertson A. was glad, too, because Mary Poppins had only one pair of shoes, and those she polished herself. But nobody ever knew what Mary Poppins felt about anything, for Mary Poppins never told anybody anything. Chapter 2. The Day Out. "Every third Thursday," said Mrs. Banks, 2 till 5. Mary Poppins eyed her sternly. "The best people, ma'am," she said, "give every second Thursday and 1 till 6. And those I shall take, or—" Mrs. Poppins paused, and Mrs. Banks knew what the pause meant. It meant that if she did not get what she wanted, Mary Poppins would not stay. Very well," said Mrs. Banks hurriedly, though she wished Mrs. Poppins did not know so very much more about the best people than she did herself. So Mary Poppins put on her white gloves and tucked her umbrella under her arm, not because it was raining, but because it had such a beautiful handle that she couldn't possibly leave it at home. How could you leave your umbrella behind if it had a parrot's head for a handle? Besides, Mary Poppins was very vain and liked to look her best. Indeed, she was quite sure that she never looked anything else. Jane waved to her from the nursery window. "Where are you going?" she called. "Kindly close that window," replied Mary Poppins, and Jane's head hurriedly disappeared inside the nursery. Mary Poppins walked down the garden path and opened the gate. Once outside in the lane, she set off walking very quickly, as if she were afraid the afternoon would run away from her if she didn't keep up with it. At the corner, she turned to the right and then to the left, nodded haughtily to the policeman, who said it was a nice day, and by that time she felt that her day had begun. She stopped beside an empty motor car in order to put her hat straight with the help of the windscreen, in which it was reflected. Then she smoothed down her frock and tucked her umbrella more securely under her arm so that the handle, or rather the parrot, could be seen by everybody. After these preparations, she went forward to meet the matchman. Now, the matchman had two jobs. He not only sold matches like an ordinary man, but he drew pavement pictures as well. He did these things according to the weather. If it was wet, he sold matches because the rain would have washed away his pictures if he had painted them. If it was fine, he was on his knees all day, making pictures in colored chalks on the sidewalk, and doing them so quickly that often you would find he had painted up one side of a street and down the other almost before you'd have time to come round the corner. On this particular day, which was fine but cold, he was painting. He was in the act of adding a picture of two bananas, an apple, and a head of Queen Elizabeth to a long string of others, when Mary Poppins walked up to him, tiptoeing so as to surprise him. "Hey!" called Mary Poppins softly. He went on putting brown stripes on a banana and brown curls on Queen Elizabeth's head. "Ahem!" said Mary Poppins, with a ladylike cough. He turned with a start and saw her. "Mary!" he cried, and you could tell by the way he cried it that Mary Poppins was a very important person in his life. Mary Poppins looked down at her feet and rubbed the toe of one shoe along the pavement 2 or 3 times. Then she smiled at the shoe in such a way that the shoe knew quite well that the smile wasn't meant for it. "It's my day, Bert," she said. "Didn't you remember?" Bert was the matchman's name. Herbert Alfred for Sundays. "Of course I remembered, Mary," he said, "but—" and he stopped and looked sadly into his cap. It lay on the ground beside his last picture, and there was 2pence in it. He picked it up and jingled the pennies. "That all you got, Bert?" said Mary Poppins, and she said it so brightly you could hardly tell she was disappointed at all. "That's the lot," he said. "Business is bad today. You'd think anybody'd be glad to pay to see that, wouldn't you?" And he nodded his head at Queen Elizabeth. "Well, that's how it is, Mary," he sighed. "Can't take you to tea today, I'm afraid." Mary Poppins thought of the raspberry jam cakes they always had on her day out, and she was just going to sigh when she saw the matchman's face. So very cleverly she turned the sigh into a smile, a good one with both ends turned up, and said, "That's all right, Bert. Don't you mind. I'd much rather not go to tea. A stodgy meal, I call it, really." And that, when you think how very much she liked raspberry jam cakes, was rather nice of Mary Poppins. The matchman apparently thought so too, for he took her white-gloved hand in his and squeezed it hard. Then together they walked down the row of pictures. "Now there's one you've never seen before," said the Matchman proudly, pointing to a painting of a mountain covered with snow and its slopes simply littered with grasshoppers sitting on gigantic roses. This time Mary Poppins could indulge in a sigh without hurting his feelings. "Oh, Bert," she said, "that's a fair treat." And by the way she said it, she made him feel that by rights the picture should have been in the Royal Academy, which is a large room where people hang the pictures they have painted. Everybody comes to see them, and when they have looked at them for a very long time, everybody says to everybody else, "The idea, my dear." The next picture Mary Poppins and the Matchman came to was even better. It was the country, all trees and grass and a little bit of blue sea in the distance, and something that looked like Margate in the background. "My word," said Mary Poppins admiringly, stooping so that she could see it better. "Why, Bert, whatever is the matter?" For the Matchman had caught hold of her other hand now and was looking very excited. "Mary," he said, "I got an idea, a real idea. Why don't we go there, right now, this very day?" Both together into the picture. "Eh, Mary?" And, still holding her hands, he drew her right out of the street, away from the iron railings and the lamp-posts, into the very middle of the picture. There they were, right inside it. How green it was there, and how quiet, and what soft, crisp grass under their feet. They could hardly believe it was true, and yet here were green branches huskily rattling on their hats as they bent beneath them, and little colored flowers curling round their shoes. They stared at each other, and each noticed that the other had changed. To Mary Poppins, the Matchman seemed to have bought himself an entirely new suit of clothes, for he was now wearing a bright green and red striped coat, and white flannel trousers, and, best of all, a new straw hat. He looked unusually clean, as though he had been polished. "Why, Bert, you look fine," she cried in an admiring voice. Bert could not say anything for a moment, for his mouth had fallen open and he was staring at her with round eyes. Then he gulped and said, "Golly!" That was all. But he said it in such a way and stared so steadily and so delightedly at her that she took a little mirror out of her bag and looked at herself in it. She, too, had changed. Round her shoulders hung a cloak of lovely artificial silk with watery patterns all over it, and the tickling feeling at the back of her neck came, the mirror told her, from a long curly feather that swept down from the brim of her hat. Her shoes had disappeared, and in their place were others much finer, with large diamond buckles shining upon them. She was still wearing the white gloves and carrying the umbrella. "My goodness," said Mary Poppins, "I am having a day out." So, still admiring themselves and each other, they moved on together through the little wood till they presently came upon a little open space filled with sunlight, and there, on a green table, was afternoon tea. And we will end right there. The next LET to read to you will be Ms. Graham. All right, so you will see her tomorrow, and I will see you next week. Have a great day. Bye.